The Democratic Party is preparing to face a mass exodus, but I think it's significant, not for the reason people think it is, but because it will signal this trend that we're seeing in society, signals a coming era of American enlightenment. My friends, the data is clear. The Democratic Party is in significant trouble. Whether you look at, for example, the decreasing number of black voters in the Democratic Party, or just the increasing number of general support in the Democratic Party that stems from the 2022 midterm elections, whether you look at what's happening in Chicago, where a lot of the reliably Democratic residents of Chicago are getting upset at how the city is handling its migrant crisis and are also, in record numbers, beginning to rebuke the progressive idea of sanctuary cities, or whether you look at Trump getting northward of 20% of the black vote, when historically, Republican candidates have only really gotten 6% in the last half century or so, something is shifting. And a lot of people will take all of these different numbers I just presented to you, and they'll have a variety of different reactions to them. Some people will say, oh, this is great for the Republican Party. Others will say, well, blacks are leaving the plantation. There are just a lot of different perspectives out there that don't really get to the core root of what's actually happening here. People, individuals, their actions aren't dictated by the electoral processes that a lot of pundits and commentators and political activists look at to divine the future of their given political party. Individuals are moved by their own free will, but they're not just moved by free will in a vacuum. They're moved by free will informed by certain ideas. The reason the Democratic Party has had a reliably docile African-American voting base for so long is not because a majority of that population just sat there and considered the merits of progressivism. Far from it, actually. African-Americans are actually socially conservative by and large. It's because there has been a tradition of habituation that has come with African-Americans knowing people in their spheres, knowing people in their families who either supported or partook in the Democratic Party, and they just go along with it in life. But every idea has consequences, and I think this is what we have to really understand here. Many of us don't see political ideas independent of elections and independent of parties. Many of us see political ideas as inherent in elections and inherent in parties. But the truth is, political ideas are not judged on the basis of, their merits are not judged on the basis of if they can win an election or not. Their merits are judged on the basis of how do they align with reality, number one, and how does their alignment with reality impact their implementation on the ground. But many of us have traded off practicality, and we've traded off looking at these more important things for what poll X says, what poll Y says, and who can win the next election. That is absolutely the wrong focus. I believe this exodus is going to be broadly indicative of a coming age of American enlightenment. My thesis is actually quite simple. Just like if we look in history, the Dark Ages, which preceded the Enlightenment era in Europe, was hundreds of years marked with poverty, with famine, with the stunting of human intellectual and moral growth, with all kind of things that suggested a certain story about the future of human civilization that looked bleak, dark, and dreary. Looked like it was in a dead end. Which is one of the reasons why, by the way, no matter what happens in the modern era, we should always have hope that the light will shine eventually. Because if you were a human born in the Dark Ages, you would have likely died thinking that the world was going to just go downhill even further and further and further. And yet, history has proven those pessimist sentiments wrong. But then the Enlightenment comes, and all this development happens. The ideas that help unlock human potential and help build the basis for a flourishing society either came in through the ancients and were implemented in the Enlightenment period, or they were refined from the ancients, from the Stoics, from the Greeks in the Enlightenment period, and they were then implemented into the nations of the world. Particularly, they manifested in the nation of America, because America is undoubtedly an Enlightenment nation. I think, just like Europe and the world had its own Enlightenment and its own Dark Ages, I think America has been in a political dark ages for the past 130 plus years. And we've seen different stages of this political dark ages, which has stunted the potential of so many Americans in their pursuit of excellence and their pursuit of human potential, and also has confused, and this is the more important thing, has confused the minds of generation after generation of Americans about the proper role of political order in their life, the proper scope of government in their life, and the proper duty of themselves to society, and the duty of society to themselves. What do you mean, Christian? Well, entertain my thesis here for a moment. I believe America entered a political dark ages in the early 1900s, or late 1880s, early 1900s, when the wholesale invasion of European ideas, particularly from Prussia, Germany, modern-day Germany, came to America's shores and infected our institutions so much so that it resulted in the blossoming of the permanent administrative state. It resulted in the creation of the modern research university, which, as Wilhelm von Humboldt said in his works, reflected Wissenschaft. Wissenschaft being education for the sake of education, and that simply being you doing something for the sake of itself and not doing anything to actually grow. So during this beginning of the Dark Ages, education went from being about helping the human being, the individual, grow and mature, to being about making sure people just say things to say things, making sure scholars just produce works to produce works, and not actually being focused on the growth and development of the child. It was more about the obedience to the state, the obedience to authority, the obedience to abstract ideas, and it was completely detached from what it was pre-1835 in America, which was education was focused entirely on the child, and not just any focus, but a focus that was relegated towards general matters of morality in the world that had nothing to do with indoctrination. That all changed during this beginning of these Dark Ages. And so these Dark Ages progressed through the years. The centralization of authority got even greater. Presidents like Woodrow Wilson signed off the entire American banking industry, the entire American currency off to private hands that to this day the Federal Reserve have been unaccountable to any corrective. And then the Great Depression happens, and there's this unleash of just mass suffering and chaos. Then after this point, we have, of course, between all this World War I happening and the attempt to force Americans into this sort of internationalist compact called the League of Nations that actually many Americans back then rejected. And of course, many Americans today, unfortunately, accept the modern-day League of Nations, which is the United Nations. And then afterwards, we go into World War II, where we're attacked and everything. World War II is when the American Dark Ages got even worse. Because World War II, and that period of time, and to this day, was cited and is cited as an example of how the government can so-called revive an economy. Because what happened during World War II? Well, during the late end of the 30s and the 40s, and in the beginning of the 40s, American industry was nationalized by FDR, it was nationalized by the progressives, and also around this period of time, Social Security was created, the modern-day welfare state was created, and so the perceptions of Americans towards the government was wholly skewed. Americans at a particular point in time in the 40s found it acceptable to be told how much they can eat and what they can eat by the government. Americans at a particular point of time in the 40s found it acceptable to be told that if you are against war, if you don't want America fighting someone else's war, you must be supporting Hitler. That's what the American government under FDR told Americans. They propagandized the masses into this undiluted, uncritical worship of the government to support an effort that very clearly has still had impacts to this very day, so on and so forth. And so after World War II, we get the post-war consensus. This establishes the United Nations. This establishes the sort of globalist internationalism that has become integral to so much American and Western foreign policy, which has propelled America into Afghanistan, into Iraq, into Kuwait, into Libya, into so many different destabilizing conflicts around the world. And at this time, coming off of World War II high, America was the dominant power. And its dominance was not attributed to its ability to reflect excellence or the ability for it to reflect freedom. Its dominance was attributed to the ability of its government to centralize the powers of society, put them into one single focus, and then use that to create some kind of effect. Americans in that era of the 20th century became convinced that the government was some super ubermensch kind of power that could then do something that they couldn't do themselves in a manner that transcended their role in society. And for decades after that, the Dark Ages got worse and worse and worse. And then this idea of America being a global power that must police the world, that became fashionable. And after that became fashionable, the idea of the welfare state being integral to the well-being of human beings became fashionable. In the 60s, Johnson established the war on poverty, which has done absolutely nothing but make the situation worse and has not really reduced poverty in any meaningful way for many different reasons. There's a different video on that different day. And then, of course, as you continue to go on, you will see downstream the effects of this Dark Ages. Iraq, Afghanistan, universal health care since 2009. You see the effects of this Dark Ages. But now I think that in the post-Trump era, and I'm not trying to make a value judgment about Trump, since when the Dark Ages began, people were so narrow in their thinking. People were so bound to certain concepts. But now we see the political wisdom that has held true for decades upon decades upon decades, going all the way back to the early 1900s. We're seeing that get challenged in a way that's not just mealy-mouthed, in a way that's not within the contours of the system, but in a way that actually fully rejects what the system is built upon. We're seeing populist candidates arise and actually challenge the authority of institutions like the NSA and the administrative state, which has been existing, and the administrative state has been existing for a very long time. We're seeing people arise and say that America's obligation is not to the world, it's not to the League of Nations, not to the United Nations, it's to our own people. That basic common sense principle has been rejected for so long. So many of you may ask, well, what does this have to do with the Democratic Party? Very simply, the Democratic Party is the culmination of the American Dark Ages. Every idea I told you, almost every idea I've told you, the Democratic Party has been behind pushing it full stop into policy and into the culture. The Democratic Party, for example, is a proponent of the administrative state. The Democratic Party, for example, is a proponent of the welfare state. The Democratic Party, for example, is a proponent of suspending the rule of law to help people who, in their abstract idea of what is correct, are considered to be victims, and therefore that manifests in the form of sanctuary cities. The Democratic Party is the vehicle that the European philosophy of progressivism, which invaded America's shores in the mid-19th century, has used to further its ascent to power. The Democratic Party is the harbinger, the defender of the Dark Ages. That means that when people begin to wake up and leave the Democratic Party, the biggest vehicle for the Dark Age thinking of American politics shatters. And the proper New World thinking of the founding can then re-enter the bloodstream of our country and begin making an effect. Now, you can't undo generation after generation of indoctrination and propaganda on so many different levels, because Americans have been propagandized to an extent that they don't even understand. To be frank with you, I don't even quite understand the extent of it. I'm only beginning to realize just how deep it goes. Everything from our foreign participation in wars, everything from the welfare state. See, many conservatives will say, I oppose the welfare state, but then they will say, I will defend Social Security. How can you defend Social Security, which is not even 100 years old? It's a relatively new invention in the history of our country, which basically says that I am responsible to pay for every single person's well-being, regardless of how they do it for themselves, and regardless of my own personal will, at the point of a gun. Social Security is a socialist redistribution scheme that has gotten cultural momentum because people have uncritically accepted premises and ideas that in all reality are fundamentally anti-American and immoral. And yet, Social Security is a sacred cow in our culture, so much so that if a politician said, I'm opposing to Social Security, what happens to him? He loses his seat or he gets primary, even amongst so-called conservatives. If conservatism is dead, which I don't believe it is, but if it is dead, it's not dead because it values human liberty, as so many will say. It's dead because it won't even stand up for what it actually believes in on the most basic level, as to reject socialism, not in rhetoric, not in posture, but actually in action by tearing down the vestiges of socialism in our own society. An invertebrate, weak, limpy conservatism that is afraid to challenge socialism or any form of collectivism because it's popular, conserves nothing, and hands off the progeny of this country to a certain end. But still, the fact that these ideas that are so deep-rooted are being dug out, and they're being questioned, and people are actually asking the question, what do I believe? Have I been told lies my whole life? Why do I uncritically support progressivism? Why did I believe this position or that position? That is the beginning, the seeds of the American Enlightenment. I'm so excited, people. This does not mean that people are leaving the Democrats to go join the Republicans. I'm not saying that. In fact, I think it's better if we evolve beyond the two-party system and we focus more on philosophy and issues and not focus at all on electoral politics and parties. Parties are the greatest disturbance to the order and the integrity of the American political system that we've known in the history of this country. It is the party system that has made every single first principle matter relegated to the dustbin of history, because the primary consideration is A, consorting with the passions of the populace, regardless of what they may be at a certain time, and B, conforming to the norms of power, those norms of power which have nothing to do with actually good governance and everything to do with maintaining your hold on power. Party politics itself is tainted by those two principles in a classically Republican system. So we have to understand the system by itself has a fault in it that must be rectified. But regardless, I still celebrate this coming of American Enlightenment, because if people are willing to question some of the most basic ideas they have held for a very long time, that have kept them in captivity under a political banner that hates America, then my goodness, what else will they do? The American Enlightenment will be an enlightenment, a period of time that restores the integrity and the importance of the fundamentally American ideas that made this country the shining beacon of freedom that it most certainly is. Those American ideas, I won't just give you platitudes, those American ideas are very simple. Natural law, reason as a value, popular sovereignty, consent of the governed, all these different things. The spiritual value of man, not as a collective creature, but as an individual in his own self. The voluntary nature of family, the importance of community that enriches the individual, doesn't enslave it. These are all fundamentally American ideas that entered political order in the first time when America was established, that have been swept under the wayside by the Democratic Party. And I'm so happy to see that so many people, minorities or whatever, are beginning to wake up and go towards a new, maybe not even new, but a correct posture on so many of these issues. But this enlightenment will only happen if many of us who understand the right principles continue to speak to these growing contingent of people that will ultimately be the ones to bring the castle down, to bring the house of cards down by refusing to stay up under it for any longer. My friends, like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. Be sure to also, if you want to help me, donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, all that is in the comment section down below. Be sure to join my Discord, which is also in the comment section down below. My friends, I am excited for the American Enlightenment. May the yoke of our dark ages break from our nation. Study history, study philosophy, and most importantly, my friends, stay convicted, stay smart, and most importantly, stay pensive. My friends, love you all. Bye-bye.